She was 21 years old. She was 3 points from history. And then the sky itself decided to stop her. What happened in the next 90 minutes would either end a dream that an entire country had been chasing for decades, or it would create a moment so unbelievable that people would replay it for years and still not fully understand how it happened. Nobody in that stadium knew which version of the story they were about to witness. Not the fans, not the commentators, not even Alex herself, because right now she was losing badly and the clock was not on her side. Let's go back to the beginning because you need to understand exactly how far she had to climb back from before you can understand what she actually did. Washington, D.C., the Mubadala DC Open. A final that nobody outside the tennis world was supposed to care about until suddenly it became the only thing millions of people could talk about. On one side of the net stood Jessica Pegula, a top-ranked American veteran who had built her entire career on one specific skill, closing matches. She didn't blink under pressure. She didn't hand out free points. She had been in this exact position more times than she could count, and she almost always walked away with the trophy. On the other side of the net stood Alex, young, rising, talented enough to make people whisper her name in hushed, excited tones, but still unproven on the sport's biggest stage. And behind her, invisible, but impossibly heavy, sat the hopes of an entire nation that had never once seen one of its own lift a WTA singles trophy. Not once, not ever. Think about that weight for a second. Imagine stepping onto a court knowing that if you lose, it's just another final. But if you win, you rewrite history for millions of people who have never had a moment like this to celebrate. That is not pressure. That is something closer to gravity. And in the opening set, that gravity looked like it was going to crush her. Pegula came out sharp, controlled, ruthless. She served with total confidence. She dictated every rally. Every time Alex tried to find her rhythm, Pegula yanked it away again. The set slipped away 64. And for the first time all tournament, Alex looked like exactly what people feared she might be. A brilliant talent who simply wasn't ready yet. The crowd filled with Filipino flags and nervous, hopeful faces went quiet in that specific way. Crowds go quiet when they're afraid to say out loud what they're thinking. Is this it? Is this how the story ends? And then just when the match seemed to be settling into its final predictable shape, something happened that nobody could have scripted. Rain. Not a light drizzle. Enough rain to stop play completely, send both players off the court, and leave thousands of fans sitting under umbrellas, staring at an empty court, wondering what would be waiting for them when the players returned. Here's the thing about a rain delay in a tennis final. It isn't just a pause in the weather. It's a pause in momentum. It's a moment that can go one of two ways. It can let a leading player cool down and lose their rhythm. Or it can let a struggling player disappear into a locker room, sit with their thoughts, and quietly decide who they're going to be when they walk back out. Nobody knew in that moment which version of Alex was going to return. Because here's what almost nobody was thinking about at the time. Inside that locker room, away from the cameras, away from the flags, away from the noise, a completely different battle was happening. Not a physical one, a mental one. And mental battles, the quiet ones nobody gets to watch, are often the ones that decide everything. When Alex walked back onto the court, something had changed. It wasn't obvious at first. She didn't come out swinging wildly or screaming with newfound energy. It was quieter than that, steadier. She stopped trying to overpower Pegula and started trying to outlast her. She gave herself more margin on her shots. She extended rallies instead of rushing to end them. It looked to the untrained eye like barely anything had changed at all. But watch closely and you'd have seen it. Rallies that used to end in 2 shots were now lasting 4, 5, 6, and each extra shot chipped away. Tiny piece by tiny piece at Pegula's control of the match. The crowd felt it before the commentators could even explain it. That's usually how it works. The energy in a stadium shifts before anyone can put words to why. Every long rally Alex won got a louder cheer than the one before it. Every hold of serve felt like a small quiet victory being banked for later. And somewhere in the middle of that second set, the entire emotional temperature of the match flipped upside down. Pegula, to her credit, did not panic. Champions rarely do. Not on the surface anyway. She kept serving with intent. She kept pushing forward, looking for the one opening that could shut the door again. But something had shifted that even her experience couldn't undo. Momentum, once it turns, does not politely ask permission before it keeps moving. It just keeps moving, and it kept moving toward Alex. Every game now felt like it carried more weight than the last. Every deuce felt like a held breath. You could see it in the way both players moved between points. Pegula searching, recalculating, trying to find the version of herself that had dominated the first set. Alex, calm, present, almost eerily unbothered by the size of the moment she was standing inside of. When Alex finally captured that second set 64, the sound that came out of that crowd wasn't just applause. It was disbelief turning into hope, turning into something almost unbearable to sit inside of. Because now the impossible had become possible. The match was even. One set apiece, and suddenly everyone in that stadium and millions of people watching from thousands of miles away in the middle of the night realized they weren't just watching a tennis match anymore. They were watching the setup for something that might actually change history. But here is where you have to remember something important. The hardest points in any sport are never the ones in the middle of the fight. They're the ones at the very end. When victory is close enough to touch, but not yet close enough to hold. That's when nerves attack hardest. That's when hands start to shake just slightly. That's when years of training either hold up under pressure or crumble the second it matters most. The final set began, and it was immediately clear that something inside Alex had settled into a different gear entirely. There was no hesitation left, no second guessing. She served with authority. She returned with intention. Every single point she won pushed Pegula one step further from the version of herself that had looked untouchable just an hour earlier. And every single point Pegula lost seemed to chip away just a little more at the composure she had built an entire career on. This is the part of the story where you'd expect drama. A screaming comeback, a miracle shot. Instead, what actually happened was almost the opposite. And somehow that made it even more powerful. Alex didn't need fireworks. She needed control. And point after point, game after game, she simply refused to give it up. The gap between the two players, a gap that had looked enormous just one set earlier, kept shrinking and shrinking until it disappeared completely and then kept going in the other direction entirely. By the time the final set reached its closing games, something had happened that almost nobody inside that stadium could have predicted 2 hours earlier. The higher-ranked player, the proven closer, the veteran who had spent years learning exactly how to win matches like this one was now the one searching for answers. And the 21-year-old who had lost the first set and looked shaken by the occasion was now playing like someone who had already decided how this story was going to end. Then it happened. One final exchange, one last ball, one mistake from the other side of the net, and it was over. Final score 46-64-6. Read that final set score again, 6-0. After losing the first set completely after a rain delay that could have broken her rhythm forever after facing one of the most experienced closers in the sport, Alex didn't just come back. She obliterated the momentum in the other direction so completely that by the end it didn't even look like the same match anymore. And the moment the last point landed, everything changed. Alex raised her arms and for a split second, you could see it on her face. That particular kind of disbelief that only shows up when your body understands what just happened before your mind has fully caught up. Around the stadium, flags that had been waving nervously all afternoon were suddenly waving with pure, unfiltered joy. Strangers hugged each other. People cried. The kind of crying that happens when you've been holding your breath for so long you forgot you were doing it. And thousands of miles away in homes across the Philippines in the middle of the night, families who had stayed up watching a live stream on their phones erupted with a kind of celebration that had nothing to do with just one tennis match. Because this wasn't just a title. This was the first time in history that a Filipina had ever lifted a WTA singles trophy. Let that sink in for a second. Not the first time in a while. The first time ever, somewhere in a small room lit only by a phone screen, a young girl who had never seen anyone who looked like her when something like this was watching it happen live, and something inside her shifted permanently. That is the part of this story that statistics can never fully capture. The scoreline will tell you 46-64-6E. It will tell you about a rain delay and a comeback and a final set that turned into a rout, but it will never tell you that turned into a rout. But it will never tell you about the version of the future that got rewritten the moment that trophy was lifted. Because here's what almost nobody was talking about in the hours right after the win. The story didn't actually end in Washington. It only just began there. Before this tournament, Alex was known as one of the most promising young players in tennis. Someone people talked about with cautious optimism. The kind of talk reserved for players who might become something special one day. That word might carried a lot of weight. It left room for doubt. It left room for the possibility that the breakthrough moment might never actually come. After Washington, that word disappeared completely. She was no longer a prospect. She was a champion. And in professional sport, that single shift in language changes absolutely everything about how a career unfolds from that point forward. Every opponent she faces from now on will prepare differently, knowing exactly what she's capable of when the pressure is highest. Every tournament she enters will carry heavier expectations because now people know what happens when she's pushed into a corner. And every match she plays will be watched by more eyes than ever before because the entire tennis world just learned something about her that cannot be unlearned. She does not fold under pressure. She rises into it. But here's the part of the story that deserves attention just as much as the final score. None of what happened in that final set was visible from the outside for most of the match. Nobody watching the first set could have predicted the third. Nobody watching the rain delay could have known what was happening in that locker room. The turning point of one of the biggest wins of her career happened quietly away from cameras in a moment where all she had was her own mind and a decision to make about which story she was going to believe. Was this a match that was slipping away from her, or was this a match that was still waiting to be won? She chose the second story, and then she spent the next 2 sets proving it was true. That is the part of this entire event that should stay with you longer than the scoreline does. Not the trophy, not the ranking points, not even the historic nature of the win itself. It's the reminder that the biggest turning points in anyone's life rarely look dramatic while they're happening. They look like a quiet decision made in a locker room during a rain delay. They look like choosing patience over panic when everything in you wants to panic. They look like refusing to accept the story the scoreboard is currently telling you, and deciding to write a different one instead. Of course, the tennis world doesn't pause to admire moments for very long. Almost immediately, attention shifted to what comes next. The US Open is waiting, and this time, Alex won't be walking in as a surprising underdog nobody saw coming. She'll be walking in as a proven champion that every single opponent will be studying, preparing for, and trying to figure out how to stop. That is a different kind of pressure entirely. It is the pressure of expectation instead of the pressure of obscurity. And it is in its own way just as difficult to carry. But if this match in Washington proved anything, it's that pressure has never actually been the thing that stops her. If anything, it might be the thing that brings out the version of her that nobody sees coming until it's already too late to stop. There will be losses ahead. There will be difficult draws and disappointing days because that is simply the nature of this sport. And no champion, no matter how remarkable, is immune to that reality. But there is something different now that wasn't there before Washington. A belief, not the hopeful kind of belief that exists before you've proven anything. The unshakable kind of belief that only exists after you've already done the hardest thing once under the brightest lights with the whole world watching. And that belief cannot be taken away by a single bad match or a difficult season. It's permanent now, woven into who she is as a competitor. So when you think back on this story, don't just remember the score. Don't just remember the trophy or the flags waving in the stands or the celebrations that lasted long into the night across an entire country. Remember the part of the story that almost nobody was watching. The quiet decision made during a rain delay when everything could have gone either way. And one young athlete chose to believe in a different ending than the one the scoreboard was suggesting. Because sometimes the most unforgettable stories in sport don't begin the moment someone is finally called a champion. They begin in the exact moment, quiet and unseen, when that person first decides to believe they already are one.